Um, Hi, Kianna. I'm Tina, exec producer of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I've been doing a lot of research and just found out a lot of great work that you've done, and it is a lot. But I'm glad that you're able to come and be here with us on the podcast. And I'll let Napoleon introduce himself.
Skiptash, ani napchugik Napoli Marietta, ani vurakmaratum tanatum and pipash, ani anastatan nagamjud akmaratum chukchanchud, habaki skigitam. So hello, Kiana. My name's Napoleon Marietta. I'm from Gila River, and I was the admin assistant for the podcast. I'm still a volunteer helping out Tina. I'm still helping things flow. Um, I just graduated prior to this from ASU. I've been there for a long time. Did my undergrad in Justice Studies and American Indian Studies. Did finished my master's, two in one in American Indian Studies with an emphasis on Indigenous rights and social justice, and another one in public administration. So, been around quite a while, and really happy to have you here and talk about some of the work that you do. I am sort of familiar with border towns. I have met folks from the Red Nation before. I've known Nick and Melanie, Dr. Melanie. So we're pretty cool. So I enjoy that sort of relationship. And so thank you so much for being here. And yeah, that's enough about me. Oh,
If you
Tina, you're
can,
on mute.
okay, sorry. Kiana, if you can introduce yourself, let the listeners know a little bit of who you are, where your traditional roots lie, and the kind of work that you've done and what you're doing now.
Kiana P. Winisha, Shitoglini Neshle, Nashisha Bashichin, Hitler, Dashiche, Damakaida Edashinella, Tisna Deshkish, Demasha, Kota Isharan, Agut Eggles, Netzanishler. Hello, thank you, first of all, for having me on the podcast. Also, congratulations, Napoleon, on graduating. Always love seeing people being successful in the academy. It's crazy. But a little bit about me. So my homelands, I'm Danette. I am Navajo. According to Navajo beliefs, where your mother is from is where you originate. So my family lives in Newcomb, New Mexico, which is about 30 minutes outside Shiprock. Everybody knows where Shiprock is. Um, and I grew up in Farmington, New Mexico, and it's had a lot of impact on the things I do and things that I decided to study and go into. But of course, we're going to be talking all about that today, but about the work that I do. So I do a lot of things. I kind of broadly, I worked in the field of Indigenous social justice and education in different spheres, which include law, policy, racial, and climate justice. At my university, I'm currently a grad student, so I'm studying politics in education at Columbia University, and I'm currently on a fellowship. And at this fellowship, I co-teach and create curriculum for high school students in Harlem that centers on how to be an activist within your community, learning about the civil rights history of what makes up Harlem. And I'm also a research assistant where I work with a legal professor in education. And this organization is called Center for Educational Equity. We advocate for children's rights to education via state constitutional law, updating financial aid formulas, and and also side projects of increasing media literacy and also civic engagement. And then at the university, I'm also working on this side project, which I've started earlier and which will be presented here soon in May. I'm working with the local Indigenous organization in the city, in New York City. And we're creating an educational toolkit, sort of webinar series describing the intersections of the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis and climate justice issues. So we'll be presenting. If you guys want information on that, I can send that to you later. But outside of the academic sphere, I also am doing other things as well. So I'm a curriculum specialist for this BIPOC youth organization called Start Empowerment. And we look at providing social justice tools for youth to learn about climate education, but also to become environmental justice leaders and to pursue their own organizing within their communities and empower them, just give them those tools. So I focus more on the Indigenous centered cultural, not sort of culture. I don't want to go too much into that in the climate justice space. I feel there's too much of that already. But just focusing on how Indigenous peoples fit within this unique sphere in environmental justice issues. My great curriculum centered around that. And then I'm also, oh my gosh, I'm singing out loud. I do a lot. And then I'm also an Indigenous Education and Policy Associate Intern with the American Institutes for Research. And right now we've been looking a lot at Indigenous and Native student counts within the education sphere, particularly connecting how policy delegitimizes resources for Indigenous students. So like, for example, there are Indigenous folks out there that don't identify within the US federal regulations. These students aren't getting that cultural support that they need. So we're looking at hopefully using this data that we're gathering to expand what Indigenous means within the education sphere. But outside of that, I do freelance writing. I work a lot in the social media space. So I've been utilizing social media since about like 2020 to create free educational resources available to the public to teach about different Indigenous issues. I've partnered with other bigger social media organizations, so places like Intersectional Environmentalist, Feminist, Impact, as well as starting to create more like longer based freelance writing. So I just partnered with Imagine 5 to talk about some of the environmental themes, land stewardship that happens within Killers of the Flower Moon, and just bringing those lenses into those spaces. But before, like, I've also worked in other spheres. I've worked at my Navajo Nation chapter throughout high school. I've done the Capitol Hill congressional thing. This was when Ben Ray Lujan wasn't our senator in New Mexico, so he was a representative when I worked at his office at the time. I've also done research at the Indigenous Social Action and Equity Center at the University of Michigan, where I focus on political engagement and Native identity, and I worked under Professor Stephanie Freiberg. And then I also did an internship with the Association on American Indian Affairs, who does a lot of work within the repatriation space.
So what do you do to take care of yourself? That's
Family. Yeah, I would say a lot of it's family, phone calls. Like I've been away from home like for a while. I haven't been home like a long period of time. I think the longest I've been home in the past couple of years has been like 2 or 3 weeks. But it's a lot of phone calls home and creating safe spaces that I'm at. So I have a couple of close friends with me in the city that I'm able to talk with and engage with, because these issues, they're hard to talk about. And it's also a lot harder when you're the one that's designated to speak about these issues and to have to engage with other people who don't agree with those opinions or don't agree with your beliefs. And so I do my best to talk with my parents. I think my parents have been my rock. I mean, they've lived through everything that I'm going through. Of course, there are some differences, but they're the knowledge keepers. They're the ones that keep me grounded. I call my grandma. I got called my grandma, my great aunties, as they call them. My siblings, I text all the time. So it's just staying in touch with family helps a lot.
Awesome. Wow. Um, Yeah, I did see. I don't know if that's part of your freelance work, but you did some an article with the Native Online News, I believe. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah, that's
I really like that. It's a really good source for information to get, and it was really cool to see that because I used to find information when I was on the main reservation here in on Tohono O'odham Nation, and I worked at the tribal radio station, and that was definitely a resource that I would go to share Indian country news.
oh yeah, for sure. And I think that I sort of came up out of that article. Well, it first came out of like my academic paper. So a lot of what I write about comes from the academic sphere, and I want to make that public to other people. I feel there's such a closed door of understanding law and policy for Indigenous communities that I just wanted to like break that and say Indigenous people should be knowing about this. And you know, non-Indigenous peoples too, because they're contributing to the problem. You should know what you're doing. But yeah,
It's great to meet you and learn all about the work that you do. I know Bree originally brought us all together, and she brought about the work specifically on your work with tribal reservation border towns, which to me, when I hear the word, just because where I'm from, when I hear the word border town, I automatically think towns that are alongside the US-Mexico border. But in the notes that Bree and Napoleon put together, that it's somewhat of a relatively new concept to Indigenous studies that responds to the ensuing violence against Native Americans. And the work or your project title, The Formation of Tribal Reservation Border Towns, Navigating Dine Identity in Injun-Killing Spaces. I guess first differentiating the term border towns from what I know it from versus what you're familiar with. Can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, of course. So, uh, my introduction to what a border town was actually, and I'll talk about this later on, came from this book called The Broken Circle, written by Rodney Barker. And in this book, he describes border town pretty vaguely, saying that it's this place where you have these two different communities that are separate from one another, different cultural values, different ideas, and many in the ways like that's true for different borders of the Mexico and so-called like U.S. border. What makes border towns with tribal reservations so interesting is that this isn't with one nation state. It's the same uh, person that is, it's only one entity that is pretty much controlling or has control. I mean, it could be argued with like US Mexico border. US has a lot of free reign on what's happening on those borders too. But I think it's interesting to put this in context within the United States. So I want to go to, I believe like the Red Nation Rising book, which was the first book to talk about reservation border towns. I believe their definition is the best explanation of what this is. So Red Nation Rising, this book is written by, of course, Nick Estes, Melanie Yazzie, Jennifer Denetdale, and David Correa. So they say the words that border and town are together. So they're all one cohesive word, and they're combined to describe the relationships that are connected within these spaces. So I'll put it in quote. What they say is like, in quote, the name itself, a noun, town, adjectively modified by the border, end quote. Yet their definition goes beyond this and says that it is actually a relationship where the contradictions of settler colonialism emerge and show themselves. So from that, they say that border towns are any white settlements because the purpose of like settlements is that to eliminate borders and to secure their land. So differentiating that from what we see with the US and Mexico border, I would argue that they're pretty much connected and they're an extension of one another. You have a lot of the indigenous tribes and groups that are down there near the border. And like after post-treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo, they were pretty much rendered to whatever said territory that they were put in. So like, for example, if you have indigenous people that somehow ended up on like Mexico, they were automatically categorized as Mexican, and they lost all indigenous identity, similar to what we'd get with like people who went on like the U.S. side. And I actually wrote a paper talking about this unique relationship that happens within border towns. And right now there's like ways that people have tried to have indigenous peoples in those areas have like more of like the free movement spaces because they aren't necessarily have those same political relationships with their nation states. So one of the ways that they've tried to navigate this is through enhanced tribal identification cards. And that in itself is a huge violation of privacy rights. So there are these like little cards you get with like these microchips in them that monitor your movement. So somebody is watching you move across from border to border. So you're having that in that area, but within border towns, I think it's really interesting because it's a sense of racialization that happens in those spaces, rendering racial violence to indigenous and native folks. And I've seen that very apparent to my movement out within the East Coast. Within the East Coast, there's of course indigenous presence here, and I'm in community with a lot of indigenous folks. But when you meet and engage with other people, there's no assumption that you are native or that you're indigenous. It's very much like, oh, like you're Hispanic, you're Latina, and like there's many like I'm pretty sure you guys have been spoken to in like Spanish all the time, but there's no assumption that you're Native American. And I've at least like 50 plus times I've been told, oh, you're the first Native American I've met. Rather, as in border towns, they know you. They know what you look like. They know how they have this assumption and stereotype of the way you're supposed to act. And I've experienced it in and outside of the education system. So it's very much you're racialized in the space, and that, but just because of how you look and how you identify, there's this automatic assumption that we get of how indigenous peoples are supposed to act. And that's what's happening in those different border town spaces.
That's a really good point because I know like in I guess for me like border towns when I think about that, like obviously the Mexico and US border, and then obviously having the third entity, which is the nation. So there's like three entities that you're facing. And with all of that is like what you're talking about is like the identity of indigenous people, right? So it's like I'm a citizen of the Tohono Nation, or I'm a U.S. citizen, or I'm a Mexican American. Like all those identities. But then what if someone is, from back and forth? Can you all hear me? Oh, sorry. Okay. Um, so that identity is interesting that you're talking about because like then you mentioned like how in some states, in some areas, you're already perceived, they already have a perceived notion, whether you're walking into a grocery store or something, they already know to surveil you. They already know to have that unique relationship already with you when you're going across, whether it's the state line or whether it's international line. And so that was really interesting because like when I think of border towns, I think of like urban cities. So like Phoenix, we have tribal communities that are occupied in like local cities like Scottsdale, like these very heavily, and of course like New Mexico, like Gallup, I'm sure is a huge one. Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and like where the reservation is like is sort of that whole boundary line. It literally is a border. Like here's a border. Y'all are supposed to only shop there, and like because we're out in Gila River, we're close to Chandler, where there's like mostly retirees and old people and people who have like their own like senior living houses, and they have their golf carts and things. compared to like Phoenix, where you have a high population of indigenous people from different nations. There's a tremendous amount of unsheltered folks. So like that's a really interesting point about when you're talking about identity and different spaces and like experiences like your own, where you're in the East Coast and it's like, oh, I didn't know. One of the things that I was even told here, like people didn't know indigenous people existed on the East Coast still, you know, or in any of the East, like, or that then because of what happened, free contact, like a lot of them were wiped out. And then you look at like some of um the Plains tribes and communities. They're like, you go there and you already know you're native. Like, oh, there's a high population of natives that live there. So many tribal communities, and that's unique. Also, like with Arizona, which obviously having some of the largest communities here. It's an interesting point that you're making, because like when I was thinking about border town, I was like, man, and then understanding like our realization of just being on reservations that are, and then how Gallup has a unique relationship and what happened in history there. So I guess like another thing I wanted to ask is like sort of, since the activism that has happened in a lot of like places like these major urban cities, where do you see that, where like the importance of bringing awareness and in the identity um in your line of work, like where has that sort of like shine through? Like what are some active changes that are happening during all of these like challenges that have, because there's like the activism part,
Yeah.
and then there's like this weird unique legal thing, and then like we're like the future of it. I guess that's sort of my
Yeah.
like question of that.
Yeah. So I guess I can start off with like the historical activism leading into now, because you mentioned Gallup. Gallup has a really history of border town violence. And this was actually my introduction into the American Indian movement and learning about how that evolved over time. So, of course, the American Indian movement, founding members, Russell Means, Dennis Banks. You also have some really cool Indigenous revolutionary matriarchs I've been reflecting on this month, looking at Madonna Thunderhawk, Phyllis Young, Janet McLeod, who are also part of the American Indian movement. But their cause was looking at, of course, it stemmed out of the civil rights movement, where we were having a lot of awareness of the injustices happening to people of color. And so their movement stemmed from that type of atmosphere, looking at the looking at the injustices happening to Indigenous folks in particular within these regions, these border town areas. And one of the catalysts of that, I think of Larry Casus. Are you guys familiar with that name? I'll just explain a little bit about who Larry Casus was. So Larry Casus, University of New Mexico student, a heavy activist um, who advocated for the rights of Indigenous and Native folks and was the Navajo. So what happened to Larry Casus? So in the region of Gallup, Gallup is like about 2 or so hours from where I grew up in Farmington. It's a huge intersection to where you get like all of the major highways. So like if you want to go, if basically if you just want to move across the state from New Mexico to Arizona, you're passing through Gallup at some point. So it's become a hub for that. But it's also where you have a lot of different trading posts that are happening. So in these areas, I don't think I talked a little bit about my thesis, but trade plays a tremendous impact on border towns because this is where trade happened. This is where white settlers and indigenous peoples met each other. So you have that's also a part of white settlement. You have white people setting up these trade and commerce and economic areas to build their profit. So indigenous people to travel to these areas to like trade and try to get by. But in Gallup, of course, on the Navajo Nation, we had a law that prohibited alcohol sales. So what better way for white settlers to make money than to set up alcohol bars in areas right outside tribal reservations. So in Gallup, there was the mayor. His name was what's his name? Emmett Garcia. His name was Emmett Garcia, and since Larry Casus, he was a University of New Mexico student. Emmett Garcia was actually going to be appointed to the Board of Regents for the university, and Garcia had advocated for like Indigenous rights and like the elimination of alcohol, but he was an owner of this bar that was in Gallup in that area. And so Casus was like, no, we're not gonna let you get away with this. And so they had set up and staged kidnapping. And David Correa has like a really good book about everything and talks about the whole event. But needless to say, they were ultimately stopped by police, and their Casus was shot and killed. And he was only 19 years old, very young. And there's a lot of things that happened behind his case that were unaccounted for. There were some reports of like him like trying to shoot himself, and which were not true. And also like after the event, there was this stilling image and of his of him in a body bag with police standing over him, and this was published in the Gallup Independent, which is like the local newspaper at the time. And so it was just gross and just obscene to hear about that. And so the American Indian movement came and started protesting on that area for Larry Casus. And this is a very similar situation to what happened in Farmington. So in Farmington, this was 1974. 3 Navajo men were found beaten and murdered. It was grotesque. I've looked at the case files, and it shows all of the horrible, malicious things that were done to their bodies. And this was done by high school students, the same high school that I attended and went to. And this came out as a result of what they call Injun rolling. And that's where the title of my thesis came from, the use of Injun in that sense. Indian rolling was sort of seen like as a rite of passage for high school students. It was similar to like a sporting event or like something that needed to be done in order to be accepted within the community. And it involved beating and stealing items of Indigenous peoples who were either intoxicated, elderly, or just couldn't defend themselves. And these were Indigenous peoples who had to rely on border towns to get by, to get different supplies for the weekends, or they needed to get just anything that wasn't available on the reservation, they would go to border towns for. So after they ended up finding like the high school students were guilty for those murders, but they weren't sent to prison, they weren't sent to jail, they were sent to reformatory school. And like during the civil rights history moment, this became like a realization of the I'm trying to find the exact word for it, but I'll just explain it to where you have sentencing people of color are more harsh than sentencing of non-white folk. So the American Indian movement got wind of this atrocity that was happening within Farmington, and they had came in and they started marching downtown, demanding for these changes to happen within the community and to reevaluate everything that was going on. So after they had staged this protest, there was a riot that broke out. And this riot, there was tear gas, people were arrested, and this called for a major reevaluation or just a conversation of what was happening in Farmington. So they had brought in a lot of commissions. So they brought in the Human Rights Commission to do an investigation of Farmington, and they gathered everything, what they call a report, a conflict of cultures, talking about the political economic history of Farmington leading into the events that sparked this outrage. And so they do a bunch of different investigations in a lot of areas. So they look at the criminal justice system, they look at the health system, mental, physical behavior programs located in the city. And from this report, they start implementing some changes within it. So we get some more health programs that are available for Navajo people. There's supposed to be this more translation areas for them to be able to read things. Just bringing in this sort of like multicultural lens, I would say, into the area. And although they established all of these programs, any program that doesn't have a good foundational support or understanding of the people it's serving aren't good. So one of the, out of that document, one of like the major things I mentioned earlier was talking about offering translation services. But recently, within like, I'm forgetting which year this happened, but it was really recent. In Farmington at the health hospital, a Navajo patient passed away due to a misdiagnosis because they weren't given a Navajo interpreter. And Farmington, like a border town that lives in the center of two IHS places, couldn't find a Navajo interpreter for that patient in between them is just a huge injustice, and also flat out refuses to serve Native and Indigenous folks. So there's still a lot of work that is going on. But Jennifer Nez Denitel, I look up to her a lot. She's the first Chinook person to ever have a PhD, but she's also a scholar and organizer and activist who's worked in and outside of the space. She is one of the boards on, she's the chair of board. I'm forgetting what position she has, but she's on the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission. And this is the first of its kind with any tribal nation in the so-called United States to have a Human Rights Commission. And it stemmed out of this violence that was happening within border towns. So it does allow Navajo people to go in and seek the humanitarian rights, seek their rights to this commission and to be able to evaluate it in a way that the U.S. will somewhat sort of listen to, or are obligated to listen to.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing that. When I was looking up your work, that's definitely one of the things I came across was the like a documentary of just exactly what you're talking about on YouTube. And for those who are listening and may be interested in checking out that, I'll definitely add a link to it in the description so you can see for yourself the work that she's done and just visualize and see everything. But it's titled The American Indian Movement, A Broken Circle, NHD documentary. So thank you for talking about that. And I'm glad that I'm able that I was able to see it and learn about it. It is shocking though. It really is. It's unfortunate. It's something I never knew that was going on in that area. But so thank you for making that known in public.
Yeah, of course. That documentary actually came out of a high school assignment. So one of my teachers, National History Day is like a academic competition. You create a project based on a historical event. There's a certain theme every year. And so the year prior to that, I did it on the Indian Removal Act. And so for this next year, after meeting my parents talking to me about the Broken Circle and learning more about the American Indian movement, about Mary Cassus, I wanted to do it on the Indian Removal Act. And at first I wasn't gonna publish it on YouTube. I was just like, I'll just leave it. This is just for academic competition. It took me to the nationals. I didn't go to nationals, so I don't know how good it would have done there. But I was like, let's just publish it. Let's leave it online. Mainly because people featured in the documentary. So like we have a he was my former middle school teacher. His name's Peter Duswood. He was in there. He wanted access to see it so he can show it to some of his classmates. One of the other people I interviewed, they were my mom's used to be coworkers, and they wanted access to it to show it to others. And then the high school teacher that proposed that was leading all of the National History Day stuff also wanted to keep it and to be able to teach it to other people or to show other people. And so from there, I just made it publicly available so anybody could watch it.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's huge, a lot of history, and things that like like I didn't even know about. It's intense. Um, the reason why I brought up like the whole some of the activism stuff is like obviously some of the fields that I've learned about research and have mentorship in, and so like when you're mentioning a lot of the work that you're doing, um, policy wise, curriculum wise, youth, and so I've sort of shifted a lot of gear towards the youth, and how they the youth can participate and be a part of these like movements that have happened. Um, my question, I guess my kind of like understanding or my question would be like how, since the so much of the work that you've done is and then now like you're doing now towards children and youth and finding their voice, like what are some for our listeners who are out there, um how do they get involved? What do they do at their local schools? Like what how are the youth, native youth, they're feeling these days, and seeing sort of them transform into, they're having that voice and empowering. Like, what can we do to empower these things? Because like youth live along, they live along the border towns. They live, across the borders, and they live in like, like cells and like areas where they get harassed sometimes at grocery stores and things. Like the kids are the ones that experience a lot of this too. So like in your field of work, what are some like ways that, having it involved and finding that voice for Indigenous youth?
Yeah, it's hard, mainly because I recognize that I grew up in a household and also had a lot of support that was academically, but also a lot of support spiritually, being connected to my community, to like my extended family, and also just having those cultural practices ingrained at a pretty early age. So I always take that in mind whenever I talk with different other youth and people talk with them because we all come with a different experience in these border towns. And I think first is get educated. It doesn't have to be in the academic sense. It doesn't have to be in those silos that a lot of schools put on you. Because obviously, like this topic I'm talking about isn't taught in school. Someone was gonna teach me it in my classroom. It's something I had to go seek out and to explore. And it wasn't the sense like it wasn't taught before. I actually learned this throughout my research that the reading about the violence that was happening in border towns actually used to be a requirement before it got barred by some teachers or some family people or some white people in the community. But yeah, going back to that, just to get educated. If you find something that really interests you, it doesn't have to be in academics. If you really like reading, go read. I think there's a lot of instances of people telling you how you should act and what you should be doing. Uh, no, like if you love making art, continue making art. Just do something that you like. I think I tell that to any people who want to be activists, who want to go into this field. Like, there's so many ways to advocate for your community that we don't think of beginning. Like we see people going out and protesting, and like that's great, like on the ground work, but we need people in the education system. We need Native and Indigenous teachers. We need Native art teachers. I mean, I was learning about art. Like art within New Mexico has like been pretty much led by like white people telling Native people that this is what you should create and this is what you're obligated to create. Um, they want to go to art space. They want to go to pursue music. I mean, we have a really great activist space that's been in music for time immemorial, and it doesn't have to be that traditional sense of like the what we call like the drum. Like we're made to create things and to explore. So yeah, the first thing I would say, just find your voice, find something that you like to do. Because if you are doing something you don't like in the activist space, it's not going to be as effective, but you're also going to burn out real quick. You're going to get tired, and it's going to be a disservice to you. So those are always my tips. Get educated, but find what you like to do. I was just on a phone call yesterday with my little sister, and she's about to be a junior in high school. I'm like, what do you want to do when you grow up? I was like, what do you want to do in high school? She's like, I don't know. I don't know anything I'm passionate about. Like, I don't know what to do. And she's in that place of like finding her voice, and which is cool because I was there at some point. But there's so much potential I see. Like, because I'm an older sister. I grew up. I'm an older sister. I have an older sister, and I have three younger siblings. I've always been in that person of like mentorship, but it's pretty cool seeing my siblings growing up, finding their niche interests and how they intersect. Like my younger brother, he wants to become a teacher, and which was interesting to me because I was like, "You're turning in assignments like you're getting." I feel like I'm going a little bit off track, but it's just watching students grow to find their voice, and it's a part piece of that's just seeking out things. If you want to get actively involved in like school, just do what you like. If that's like again said art, if you want to actively take roles, run for student council position. That's what I did. These spaces are hard, I would say, because you're working with teachers, and teachers aren't the best and great, especially when it comes to young Native children in leadership positions. But take up those spaces that supposedly aren't meant for you and be there. I always, one thing I talk with my dad and my mom a lot about is I like seeing white people surprised at what Native people can do. I think it's one of the things I relish in, or one of the things that I love to see is Native people prove others wrong. Like we know how smart we are, we know how creative we are, we know what's right, and to see just those faces of shock, like, oh my gosh, you're Native and you're speaking out. Like we have been speaking. Sorry, I feel like I'm going off your question.
No, this is good. I like this because
Mhm.
one of the fascinating things when I was going to school was like hearing that the Indigenous excellence is like I have a friend who is recent, not recent, but before Miss Navajo Nation. I knew her um, um, when she was at ASU, and she was an aerospace engineer. And these are just like, what? You're doing what? Like, I don't want to hear, like, American Indian studies is everywhere. Like, you throw a rock and you hit AIS. Oh, what's your major? AIS. Oh, what's up? But you hit, like, masters or people, like, even undergrad in psychology or digital culture or aerospace engineer or electrical engineer. And you're like, what? What is that about? And that's cool because, like, you're mentioning, like, how, like, Native people, like, we get involved in all these different things, and we're finding that there's always that question is like, how did you want to get involved in that? Like, um, that's very, very passionate about it. And so I always remember those times, just meeting those different relationships and how important community is, especially when we're talking about some of these harsh, uh, histories, especially when it's happening still, like when we do this research to, white folks, like, or people in institutions, like, oh, that's some good historical context. It's like, actually, if you go down to Gallup or something and you go with me, you'll probably be watched, or you go to the Bashes or Safeway, we'll probably be watched in Scottsdale. So, these are real life experiences that we bring to the table, other than like, oh yeah, the indigenous people have it hard and all this other stuff, but it's the focus is more morally, I guess, less than just like beating down a lot upon us, but it's actually showing like where we're uprooting a lot of our knowledge toward to be teachers and things of that nature. And so I appreciate that too, because like the youth are so important, and sometimes it's as they're growing, and learning about different things like that are not taught in school. Um, or like if there are things that are taught that are misinformation, you know, um, learning about things taking and all this stuff, and wondering why uncle and the teacher got into an argument, like why are you guys arguing, because Thanksgiving is like, people contest it, all these things that are wrongly taught in our schools and things. So um yeah, thank you so much. And I also want to plug in, this is how I kind of stumble. I Bree was like talking to me, and she said, "Oh yeah, Kianna P," and I was like, "I think I don't. I think I've like slide through TikTok. I'm not much of a TikToker. I'm not a native TikToker or whatever. But I think I seen you talk about one that was fairly recent. And if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. There was the one about identity. I think it was the one about was it identity? I don't remember, but it was fairly recent. Um, and then I was like, "Oh, that's cool." So then I was like watching a lot of education of like what you were talking about and some of your TikToks. I think that's a really also another way that youth are engaged, especially with this native TikTok. Some of it is cringe, but some of it is really like good stuff that people are talking about. Because a lot of our youth are watching that, and so I like people, even me, like who's turning 30 today, and like I still figure out. I still slide through and see follow the ones that are really good at talking about border towns, talking about identity, things like that. So I just wanted to plug in if you all listeners aren't following Kianna, definitely follow, um, because this is good information. So yeah, I don't know, Tina, if you had anything.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like the content that you put out there is very informative, very educational. Following your Instagram, you put out just information that's not easily accessible unless you're digging online. So thank you for putting in that work and simplifying some of this information as well. And that's also what we need to help us to better understand the root of different causes or what's happening today and the effects, whether it's environmental, politically, in the world of activism. I feel like you're definitely doing a really good job with what you're putting out on your content. So thank you, Kianna.
Thanks. It means a lot. I always have like imposter syndrome in any of those spaces that I'm like, is it good? Is it not? I'm like, and people ask like, can I? Because I meet people and they don't know like my social media is like a lot of educational stuff. So I'm always weary when they ask, can I follow you? And I'm like, sure, but I post this and this. Uh, but yeah, in a way, like it's I talk to like I have big journalist friends and they're like, oh, I'm writing this piece and this piece, and they're like, in a way, you're kind of doing like journalism. And I was like, what do you? And I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, well, you every single like post you have is it's a story. You're giving it context. You're giving research. You're inserting quotes and pictures. That's journalism. And I'm like, oh,
Wow. Yeah, I guess I just assumed that also.
yeah. Mhm. But it's great. It's something that I like doing, and I don't take payment from it. I don't think it's something that I enjoy doing, and if people benefit off of it, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, great. But if there's real people out there that need this funding of my communities that are doing the work, so I always say like, no. But again, I'm a freelance writer, so if you're asking me to make something for, yeah, I'm gonna,
Yeah.
yeah.
Going back to the topic of border towns, I was looking at this article online from High Country News. And it was written by Kaylin Goodluck, and it's titled "The Everyday Violence of Indian Countries, Bordertown," and it talks about Zachary Bear Hills and what he experienced, what he went through, and part of that violent legacy of Indian countries, border towns. And so for those, just to kind of go back and for the listeners to get a little bit more of an understanding. So the towns, border towns, the towns and cities outside Indian reservations where Indigenous and white residents live side by side, and that the book Red Nation Rising from Border Town Violence to Native Liberation by Nick Estes, Melody Kayazi, Jennifer Nez, Danette Dale, and David Correa, I believe. It illuminates the long overlooked violence that has plagued Indian countries, border towns from early settler colonialism days to today. So again, if anyone out there wants to learn more, that's a book you should definitely check out. Thank you, Kianna, for introducing that as well earlier in the conversation. But I also wanted to share this quote because I thought it's pretty powerful, and it's so simple. But this quote is simply said that, end quote, "The settler got the world, the Indian got the reservation." That so pretty strong words, but definitely something to think about and consider. I just wanted to add that. I don't know if you had anything else, Napoleon.
So yeah, that's a great quote. Definitely check out those resources and follow Kianna in any space that you're in. So I guess my final question is like, where do you, I looked at your thesis, and it was the slides and everything, what you were doing to put implications out there at the end. So how can like future for the listeners out there, what is this? What can people take from your research, for building on it more? Like for future research, like you see, you've achieved this. Now, what can people do when they read and be like, man, what? There's just so much. Like, as you break it down, you did a really good job of breaking it down, and with like, like jargon and everything, like legally and everything else, how we can perceive these high end like definitions. But like for your research, what would you tell someone like me if I was willing to do more work on border towns? Like, oh, first of all, read this, and then like, where would you give someone suggestions on like for building future research? Or do you see the future from your research going?
That's a good question. And that's something that I've been questioning for a while, what I wanted to do with my thesis and what I want to do with it afterward. But the conception of it, like I talked about why I want to write about border towns, but why I wanted to particularly focus on the identity piece is because I had a hard time navigating who I was in that space. It's a lot of code switching in and outside of school. But there were also things I didn't realize that my parents did when I was growing up. So like my parents would let me go to sleepovers. They would make sure I get to and from school. So they would drive us to and from school. And then as I started like interacting with like my cousins who lived on the reservation, they were like, Farmington's like racist. And I was like, what do you mean? And they were like, yeah, it's like race, like a racist town. And I was like, okay. And it's like coming to that realization of like, wow, I'm in a space where I'm limited in expressing who I am. And there's a lot of ways that my parents were protecting me from all these different areas. So when you say building upon research, I really want research that focuses on the Indigenous and how to help the Indigenous and Native folks in those areas, and particularly youth. So one of my teachers I had growing up in high school, actually the one that helped me with the documentary academic thing, she is actually looking at creating an equity council within our city. And so, because of the topics I've been speaking about and working on for the past couple of years, he was like, "Hey, could you like help set some sort of like guideline or some advice on how we create equitable spaces for Indigenous and Native folks?" So I would say it really, I like as a parent with, not as a parent, as somebody with parents who are educators who work in the education space and who I myself is possibly going to work in that same area, I really see education as not necessarily a catalyst for change, but education as a space for change. If that's on the reservation, outside the reservation, uh, making sure we are meeting youth and their needs to the extent that it needs to be. So in my thesis, I talk with a Native American director within the high school that I went to. And like reminder, this is the same high school that had that same racialized violence that was going on. And they've had like this different types of programming over the years, but again, like if you really want to help these students take this knowledge that you're learning and use it in those positions, those small positions that are there. There was also another person I interviewed. Are they the school board? They're like the school board president, and they were like the first Native school board president like ever in Farmington. And that in itself has shifted some perspectives of Native and Indigenous folks. So activist wise, it's hard because you need to have some sort of position for people to look at you or to people to take you legitimately. But again, there's open meetings, there's school board meetings. I know there's an Indian Youth Council within Farmington that youth can join and participate in. My aunt actually helps run some of the things there for Native and Indigenous folks. Like get involved with your, like if you're in close proximity to like your home community, get involved with your chapter, see what's happening there, see what type of financial aid they have, what type of work opportunities are there for you, opportunities for you to cultivate career and college opportunities that are catered towards youth. But then again, that comes with the caveat of you having the access to go to and from. So it's tricky. But I do I do want to go back home. I think like after I get this degree, I want to go back home and create some type of impact. I don't necessarily what that looks like. I don't know what that looks like now, but it is going to be youth centered and youth led, and that's my hope, and I want to keep with that hope. And my heart goes out to all Indigenous youth out there who are navigating. I mean, I'm still youth. I have so much to learn, and throughout these next 10, 15 years, so like so much to learn about. But that's what I hope to do in the future.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kianna, for the work that you're doing in the community for the community and for your willingness and just the desire and the curiosity that you have to undig some pretty important information for future generations to learn from as well. But yeah, so thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us on the podcast. But one last question I did have. So since, the 70s when all that had happened, has Farmington changed when it comes to being racist? I'm not familiar. I'm not too
Yeah.
familiar with north, like that far up in the states or areas.
Mhm.
But for those who are not familiar, who don't know the history, and I'm just learning about it through you, um, what's it like now?
In many ways, it's like the covert racism that I feel many people experience. So it's not like all right, like a lot of like the slurs, you don't usually hear those anymore. A lot of like the terms you usually don't hear anymore. Uh, but it's like small things. I my dad actually called me the other day, or I called my dad the other day, and he was like, "Oh, a Facebook memory came up today," and it was like 5 or so 6 years ago. We were at I forgot which restaurant we were at. We were at some restaurant, and I remember this older white lady saying, "Oh, like go back to the reservation," and that was like, oh, I was like, oh, okay. But then like my automatic reply was like, we don't live there. We don't live off there. And my dad's like, yeah, I remember you were so riled up and you were ready to go at him and you were ready. And I was like, yeah, I was like, sure. But she was like a mother of the student that we went to school with. And like my brother knew the student. So it's that also you have like
Yeah.
that generational racism that's still ingrained within the community and it's being taught in really new ways um, to harm the indigenous peoples and now there is definitely like an influx of Native people within Farmington now. There's also a lot there's also like an increasing Pacific Islander population within the area, Black population, but it's also looking at the systems too. Like the criminal justice system is horrible to Native and Indigenous folks, and we're over criminalized, highly surveillance, even within those systems that are still there. And I mentioned earlier the healthcare system. Healthcare system again. You have elders who go into the nursing homes, who go get checkups. And, like I said, there's no people that translate them. Or you have healthcare providers that aren't listening to these Native and Indigenous folks. So, yeah, it's not right in your face, but those structures in place, they're all still there.
Okay. Wow. Man, that's great. That's intense, but you know, all we can hope is for the future, the younger and the future generations to really make some changes and impacts. And it first starts with just learning about it and addressing some of these, well, a lot of the issues to create the change that needs to be made. And you're right, yeah, the generational um attitudes, racism, personalities that, like you mentioned, it was an older white woman that made that. But yeah, that's crazy. But thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate that. Napoleon, did you want to have any last questions or thoughts?
No, thank you so much for being here with us and giving the listeners some um, really a worldview, just some your perspective and as always keep up the good work that you're doing and yeah, thank you so much for sharing with us and giving us our a lesson. We're like your students, and so you've made two more students. So yeah, but that's it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I don't know if this is going to go to listeners, but thank you, listeners, for listening to me. This is something that's really really important to me, like a subject I want to continue learning about and expand upon. And I thank all of the previous Indigenous organizers and scholars who have grounded this work and are setting foundations to build upon it and to create interconnections of solidarity. Particularly, I look at Jennifer Denadel, who's raised generations of Indigenous scholars and activists. So like she's worked with Augusta, she's worked with Hillary. I'm sure you're aware of Napoleon. She's reproducing a lot of revolutionaries who are doing this on the ground work. And I'm just a very small piece, it's a very small piece helping in that already movement that's there and has been ongoing.
Wow, amazing. Well, for any other listeners tuning in out there, feel free to check out the description. There are going to be some helpful links there for you, the YouTube clip that we talked about, and any online articles about specifically talking about border towns. You can find that all in the description. And if you want to learn more about the podcast, check out our website, toyoungvoices.com. And again, check out Kianna Pete on her socials, where she shares a lot of really informative content for you out there. So thank you all so much for listening to Tohono O'odham Young Voices podcast featuring myself, Tina, and co-hosted by Napoleon.